The Holocaust heroine. I'm Judy Baumel-Schwartz, and for the next few minutes, we're going to be discussing this question and examining exactly what the definition of a Holocaust heroine is. Heroism. Let's start with the definition of the word heroism. Heroism means great bravery, putting others first, even at your own peril. Heroine, defined as a woman admired for her courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Holocaust, we already know, the cataclysm that occurred between 1933 and 1945, started by Nazi Germany, ending up throughout Europe and other countries that were conquered by Nazi Germany. The fate of 6 million plus Jews under the Nazis, which was supposed to be the fate of all Jews under Nazi domination and in other countries. So if we're talking about a Holocaust heroine, then we're talking about somebody, a woman, who is admired for her courage during the Holocaust, for her outstanding achievements, or for her noble qualities. But what actually made a woman a heroine during the Holocaust? Let's take a look as a starting point at a couple of questions that will give us a bit of an insight into the dilemma of discussing who a heroine was during the Holocaust. What did a woman have to do during the Holocaust in order to be recognized as a heroine? But let's take that a step further. What made women's heroism during the Holocaust different than that of men? Can you really speak about a pattern of women's heroism? Is it something that repeats itself over and over in different places, in different countries, under different situations, with different women? Or does it express itself differently under different situations? Is there any particular repetition of behavior that you can put a finger on and say, that's heroism? Well, let's take a look at a question that's even a little bit more difficult. Could someone be a fraternizer or even be seen as a collaborator during the Holocaust and yet be a heroine? Let's look at the following story. Someone I know who was a Holocaust survivor described what happened to her in her block in Auschwitz. She used to work in one of the sorting warehouses where she had access to food. And as she would walk back to her barracks, she saw a group of small children. She couldn't figure out what they were doing there, but they were there, they were by themselves, and they were standing at the gate between, or the fence actually, between where she was walking and where their barracks were. And they begged her for food. And the next day she made a small package and she threw it over the fence with the food that was in this warehouse. Of course, this is something that, had she been caught, and she was caught, is punishable by death. And she did this for several days running, and one day she was caught. Somebody saw her do it, one of the Nazi officers, and she was put under guard, and she was told that she was going to be given 100 lashes, and then she would be hung that night. And they gave her the lashes, but her sister, who was also in Auschwitz, turned to the head of their block in the camp and said, you have a friend. In other words, she had someone with whom she was intimate among the Nazis. This is a Jewish woman. You could see her as a collaborator because she had a Nazi boyfriend. This true was not allowed, but it happened in this case. And she said, go and beg him that they won't kill my sister. And she went and she put her life on the line and she asked for the life of this woman who I knew. And after begging this man, he saved her. He gave her another set of lashes, and instead of hanging her, he let her go back to her barracks. Now, that woman, seen by most of the other women, is a collaborator. She has a Nazi boyfriend. How can she do something like that in Auschwitz? And yet she used that in order to save the life of another Jewish woman. So is she a heroine, or is she a collaborator, or is she both? In other words, things are a little bit more complicated than it looks like in the first place. And here's another question. Who determined that someone had been a heroine during the Holocaust? Who makes the decision? It's not something that just happens by itself. In order to be labeled a heroine during the Holocaust, somebody had to label the person. Who is that person? Is it only somebody who actually went through the Holocaust? Somebody who went through the war? Is it somebody who is looking from the outside? Is it a bystander? Is it someone who had no personal connection whatsoever? Who determines who is a heroine during the Holocaust? And here's another question. Why are the names of some heroines familiar to people while others remain completely anonymous? And until you hear their story, you've actually never heard of them before. In other words, it's not so cut and dried that this person is a heroine. A person can do heroic acts. A woman can do wonderful things, save people, show great bravery, have what was it that we said before, have noble qualities that would give her standing, but somebody has to give her standing. It doesn't just happen by itself. Well, in order to understand it, let's go back to the question of studying women during the Holocaust. The first studies of women during the Holocaust were actually begun during the war. There was an underground secret archive known as Oneg Shabbat in the Warsaw Ghetto that was run by Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum. He had researchers, historians, and others working for him, all this secretly, in order to document the lives of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto during the war. One of his researchers was a woman by the name of Cecilia Slepak. She did research on the topic of women during the Holocaust. She interviewed women, and in her interviews, she noted where women were especially noted for their bravery in action during the war in the Warsaw Ghetto. So these are the first women who were actually labeled by another woman going through the war at the same time as a Holocaust heroine. After the war, however, things changed. People in the outside world who hadn't gone through the war, in the free world, looked questioningly very often at women survivors, and they would ask, how exactly did you survive? And here's another story. A young girl who survived the war at the age of 13, 14, came to pre-state Israel, where she was sent as an orphan to study in a boarding school, in a religious girls' boarding school. And the other girls in the boarding school, all of them were about 14 years old in her grade, looked at her and they said, how did you survive? How many Nazis did you have to sleep with in order to survive the war? In other words, that was the picture of if you were a survivor. There was no heroism involved, no bravery involved. In other words, women who survived were looked at as collaborators. And this leads us to the next point. In the public eye, particularly in the free world, a true heroine usually could not have survived the war, because if you survived, it meant that you collaborated or you cooperated or you were doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Otherwise, a good heroine is a dead heroine. And to quote one of the women who was involved in negotiations with the Nazis and trying to save Jews in Budapest during the war, Hans Brandt, when she came to pre-state Israel, her comment was, they would have treated me differently had I come back in a box, in other words, dead. Otherwise, there's a lot of criticism about any person who survived, and particularly women, who it was looked at as if they had to do something that was probably immoral in order to survive the war. Now, there was one group that was exempt from being looked at like that. Those were women survivors who were also ghetto fighters and partisans. And unsurprisingly, many of the early memoirs that were written by women survivors, particularly in the state of Israel, were those that were written by former ghetto fighters, former partisans, etc., because these were women who one could look at society, could look at, in a minute we'll discuss what is that society, as heroines. They survived because they fought. They survived because they had a gun in their hands. There was no question of their collaboration or of their immoral cooperation with Nazis in order to survive the war. Only in the 1980s and onwards were numerous memoirs of women's Holocaust survivors published. in which they showed what average life, if you could even use such a term, was like. In other words, women who had been in ghettos, women who had been in hiding, women who had taken on a false identity, women who survived concentration camps, women who survived death camps. When those were published, all of a sudden the public got a bit of a different picture of what women's lives were like during the Holocaust. And this, of course, includes what women's heroism is. Now, that leads us to another question, a hierarchy of remembrance. Who does a nation remember? If you remember, we said a few minutes ago, why are there heroines that we know their names? And why are there heroines whose names don't really exist in public memory? So a nation remembers those that they are taught to remember. There's a hierarchy of heroism. Those who are considered complete heroines, those who are on top, and everybody knows that that is the name that comes to mind. The groups that create this hierarchy of heroism in the public mind are first and foremost agents of memory. Those are powerful groups. They can be political parties, they can be social movements, they can be economically powerful groups that promote a heroine's memory. They do it not only using their power, but the same thing is true about heroines who had friends who survived the war, who were very involved in social connections, because in order to be brought to the public mind, you need someone to do it. That someone who does it has to first want to do it, have a reason to do it. A political or a social group can be using a particular heroine for their own purposes. Friends obviously want to promote the memory of their dear friend who was killed during the war. The same thing that has to do with social connections. The more social connections that heroine, the dead heroine, had, the more it was possible to find people who would be willing to do something to bring her memory to the public. How is it done? Bringing your memory to the public is just a plain statement, but how is that translated into reality? The first is public commemoration. Public commemoration can mean the visual, in other words, naming a street or naming a playground or naming a building or naming a kindergarten after a particular person. Memorials. Memorials can be the physical memorials, what we call plastic memorials, setting up memorial stones, setting up a statue someplace, or it can be putting up a plaque, or it can be a memorial event, holding events, writing books about that person. In other words, bringing their name to the public mind. Heroines also do well when they fit a stereotype. The stereotype is your average Western stereotype. A heroine should be young. She should be beautiful. It helps if she is unencumbered by any type of intimate relationship. It also helps if her death was the martyr's death, and particularly helps if she is dead. As we said before, a real heroine is a dead heroine, because if you're alive, then after the war, you went on to continue to live, and who knows what would happen? You would get older, you would do various things, and then people would look and say, that was a heroine maybe during the war, but today, if you look at her actions, in other words, better a heroine who ended her life sometime during the war, did not go on to mature to do other things which might not fit the stereotype of what a heroine is. I want to bring an example to show you how a hierarchy of heroism propelled Chana Senesh, one of the World War II parachutists from the Yishuv, pre-state Israel, who ended up in Europe. She parachuted into Europe with a double mission, a mission from the British Army, of which she was an officer in the British Army, and a mission for the Zionist movement, for the Yishuv, to try and reorganize the Zionist movement because she was originally from Budapest, she was supposed to eventually end up in Hungary, which at the time was a satellite country, but during the time that she parachuted into free Yugoslavia, into the small enclave in Yugoslavia that was free, then Hungary was taken over by the Nazis. Chana Senesh ended up going into Hungary secretly. She was caught. She was imprisoned her mother, who ended up in prison with her and afterwards released, was one of the main people who kept her memory alive. Hannah Senesh was tried and she was sentenced to death, and she was shot towards the end of the war in November 1944. She was buried in a Budapest Jewish cemetery. After the war, after the State of Israel was established in 1950, her body was brought to Israel and it was buried on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem in the parachutist section. Even before her body was brought to Israel, Hannah Senesh was considered a Holocaust heroine. Now, if you take a good look at her story, she has all of the elements necessary in order to fit the stereotype. She was young, 23 at her death. She was a good-looking young girl. She was unencumbered by any relationships. She didn't have boyfriends. She didn't have a husband. She died a martyr's death, having been tried by the Hungarian court and actually sentenced to death. And the sentence was carried out as a traitor to Hungary under the Nazi rule, this is, of course. And she also belonged to a kibbutz movement, to a political movement in pre-state Israel, the Kibbutz HaMauchad, that needed a martyr. They needed a Holocaust heroine, better even a heroine than a hero. Why? Because the other political kibbutz movements, Kibbutz Artzi, they had lots of heroes and heroines, because most of the heroes and heroines from the uprisings and the undergrounds, particularly in the Warsaw Ghetto, belonged to that political group. And therefore, her political movement, Senesh's political movement, the kibbutz that she had belonged to in pre-state Israel before she parachuted into Hungary, basically decided that they were going to make her into their heroine. She fit the stereotype perfectly. She also was the daughter of Bela Senesh, who was a national author and poet in Hungary. She had come from an assimilated Jewish family. She discovered Zionism in the late 1930s, and as a Zionist, she came to pre-state Israel, and she ended up joining a kibbutz, etc., etc. This is a perfect story, and she's got the political group behind her that had social and economic clout. She was also a writer. She left a book of poetry, and this was perfect. There was something that they could publish, so they didn't only have to write a book about her, they actually had books by her. However, she was only one of 7 members of the parachutist movement who lost their lives between 1943 to 1945. Another one was Chaviva Reich. Chaviva Reich was from Slovakia, was 30 at her death. She actually managed to parachute into Slovakia, and for a period of several weeks, she was living with a group in the enclave, the free enclave of Yugoslavia, where there were lots of Jewish refugees. She organized them. She created a kitchen for them. She created schools for children. And she too was caught. And together with another one of the parachutists, Raphael Rice, they were shot in that area by the Nazis. Her body was recovered and it was brought back in 1952. And it was also reburied in the parachutist section in Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Chaviva Reich, on the other hand, belonged to a political party that had lots of heroines and lots of heroes from the Holocaust. Therefore, they were not in as desperate need as Hannah Senesh's political party was. Yes, there were streets named after her, and there were memorials, books were written about her, but she wasn't as young as Hannah Senesh. She wasn't as beautiful as Hannah Senesh. And she, unlike Senesh, was encumbered by relationships. She had had a husband, and then she had a boyfriend, and that was already too much for public memory. And of course, she did not leave poetry such as Senesh did. And therefore, she's up there in the hierarchy of heroism. But if we're going to look at a pyramid of heroism, Senesh is far above her. So if we go back to our first question, who does a nation remember? It remembers those that are propelled into the forefront of public memory. And here we've had an example of how that's done more for one than for another, even though both women were on the exact same mission and met death under the Nazis in Europe. Let's go back to Holocaust heroism in general. How does a woman become a heroine during the Holocaust? These are examples of categories in which women were active during the war and through which we can say women became heroines. Food, for example. Women were, for various reasons, very often responsible for putting together food for their family. If we're talking about women in ghettos, and if we're talking about women under situations where food was scarce, a woman who sacrificed herself, who risked her life to find food, to get food, to smuggle in food into the ghetto, to buy smuggled food, to do something to obtain food for her family, she could be considered a heroine. Children, in many situations when they were either in ghettos, what were known as akziot, in other words, actions of roundups, where children were taken, or if we're talking about arriving at a death camp, where children are removed from their parents, and usually they're with their mothers, children are sent to death. Mothers who could have saved themselves, who went to death with their children under these circumstances, are another example of heroism. There's physical resistance. That means belonging to the partisans. That means being part of ghetto uprisings. In Hebrew, that's known as hitnagdut. Women who are active in physical resistance against the Nazis. It's a form of heroism. Another form is what's known in Hebrew as amidah. That's educational, cultural resistance against the Nazis. Martyrdom. Women who went as martyrs, heroines. That is known in Hebrew traditional parlance as Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of the Lord. And then women who did not necessarily die, but they put themselves into great danger in order to continue their religious beliefs and their practices. That was known in many cases as Kiddush HaChaim, in other words, sanctifying life as much as they could. These are examples of categories in which women could show their heroism during the Holocaust. However, things get a little bit more complicated when we look at it from a different angle. Many actions of heroism, women's heroism, actually had a flip side. For example, food. A woman who went out to find food, in many cases, that food went to her family because it did not go to somebody else's family. In other words, obviously for that woman, her family was most important. However, that's the flip side of it. By obtaining food for her family, by hook or by crook, sometimes that meant that another Jewish family in the ghetto would go without food. A woman who went to death with her children so that they would not be alone during the last moments of their life. If we look at it, not from when we would call it the Western gendered perspective, what is expected of women's or mothers' behavior, and we say that had that woman saved herself, she could have had additional children after the war. In other words, she was sacrificing a potential future family in order to go to her death with this child. Physical resistance. Physical resistance also had a flip side. The flip side is that many of the young women who became ghetto fighters or joined the partisan movements did so by leaving their own families. And in some cases, they were responsible for elderly members of the family. They were the ones who brought food. They were the ones who were going out to work. And as a result of that, their families could eat. Now, by joining the partisans or by leaving the ghetto and going into the resistance, in many cases, they were basically abandoning their families to death. So that's the other side of it. In other words, you save A, but you've had to sacrifice B. So that's the flip side of heroism. In fact, former partisan Heike Grossman described that when she had to take on a non-Jewish identity when she was part of the resistance. And she had to stand from the distance and see the ghetto being cleared out, including seeing her own family, seeing her mother being taken away knowing that her mother was being sent to death. But had she tried to break away, she wouldn't necessarily have been able to save her mother, but she would have also blown her own cover, which she had to keep in order to remain part of the resistance. She said more than once that that was a dilemma that had absolutely no solution, and that she lived for the rest of her life knowing that that was the flip side of what she did. In other words, heroism, which sounds like the most wonderful and pure thing in the world, isn't always so pure. So, when does one earn the term heroine? Is it connected to the choice of a particular action, or only determined when the result of that action becomes clear? Is it the same for all cases? We talked about Hannah Senesh or Haviva Reich before, a Jewish woman who volunteers in the British Army, parachutes into Europe in the hope of helping Jewish communities under collaborationist regimes. Is she a heroine then because she made the choice to parachute into Europe? Or only after she's caught and put to death by one of those regimes does she become a heroine? When exactly does it happen? When does she transfer from the framework of doing to the framework of being? In other words, being a heroine. Who determines what Holocaust heroism is? And who was a heroine during the Holocaust? Who makes the decision? Who is that heroine? Survivors, onlookers, bystanders, upstanders, any of those groups? Again, a question for which we do not necessarily have an answer. And to conclude, as I said, there are not necessarily answers to our questions, so I'm going to conclude with 3 questions. How much is women's Holocaust heroism actually an outgrowth of the Western gendered expectations of women? We expect mothers to go to death with their children. And we know of a case that was written up actually by a non-Jew who was in Auschwitz, where a woman during a selection, when her child was taken away, she tried to hide. She tried to hide from that child, and they were going up and down and looking for the mother of the child. She wanted to save her life. Is that what we would call an anti-heroism? Is that the opposite of heroism? Or is that just our Western gendered expectation that a mother will be willing to sacrifice her life no matter what for that child, even if it doesn't mean saving the child, even if it means just accompanying a child to death? Second question, by focusing on women's Holocaust heroism, are we doing a disservice to Holocaust memory by separating these women and thus their ultimate fate from that of men? Now, this is contrary to Nazi actions. For the Nazis, Jewish women and Jewish men, all of them were supposed to be killed. That was their ultimate fate after the final solution was decided upon. So by focusing on Holocaust heroism of women as opposed to that of men, are we trying to say that they have a different fate? The answer here is no, we're not. But there were those who used this argument in order to try and underscore the dangers of dealing with the topics of gender and the Holocaust. And our final question, how can we examine the gendered component of women's Holocaust heroism while remaining true to the general Jewish fate during the Holocaust? These are all questions that historians such as I, who deal with the topic of gender and the Holocaust and Holocaust heroines, grapple with all the time. And as I said about other things, it's a very fine line in which there is, as in general in Holocaust study, a lot of gray and not just the stark black, white, yes, no. Things can become very complex when we're looking at an entire picture. The only thing that I can say as somebody who has dealt with the topic of the Holocaust and with the topic of women in the Holocaust for so many decades already, that it is really incumbent upon us to enter into these discussions with a tremendous amount of humility, knowledge, and the hope to try to reach conclusions that will be, as we say as historians, as close to the truth as possible. Thank you very much for listening.